Hey YouTube fam, it's Tom. I'm back for more painting. I was very excited. Yesterday was the first snow day here in the city. It often snows in the winter here in New York, but generally not till much later in the season, so I was thrilled. I am one of those people who loves winter. Or I like snow. I guess that's better to put it that way. I'm not a huge fan of winter, but I do love snow. Of course, living in the city, I don't have to shovel it or drive in it, so it's easier for me to say. Anyway, yesterday I took a very long hike out in Central Park, very near to my apartment. And no, I didn't paint plein air. It's a little too cold for that sort of thing. I'm not one of those plein air survivalists. And definitely painting watercolor in below freezing temperatures is a no-go. That's not going to happen. And plus it was just much too cold. So I took a bunch of photos, and I'm working today from a photograph, a couple of photographs really. This is near the southern end of Central Park. This is the Bow Bridge, very famous old bridge from the mid-1800s, and a bit of a stream. Anyway, very beautiful. In the distance you can see the Plaza Hotel. I took both a vertical and a horizontal image. I like both, but somehow I think the horizontal is a little quieter. It's a little more centered around the ground plane and a little more human experiential in feeling, I believe. Yeah, I talk a lot about formatting and whether you should go vertical or horizontal, but I just think in brief, all I want to say is for this, I think the horizontal emphasis on the ground plane makes it a generally more experiential type of painting. And for those of you who follow me regularly, you are probably saying, okay, where's your reference photo? I mean, where is your value study? I am making a little history. I'm not using one. I don't think I need a value study. It's very rare I don't do one. I would say more than 95% of the time I do, but I think in this case, I want to make, it's very simple study in lights, darks, and mid-tones. So I think in this case, I'll modify the values a little, make people or person I put in the foreground, and this tree, a bit of the bank here, probably the darkest elements. The bridge, dark, but not quite as dark, and these trees faded out slightly, and obviously the background faded out. So I'll have light in the snow, dark here, bit here, and mid-tone. It just seemed altogether pretty simple, and a rare case where I just don't think a value study will add a lot. I love doing winter paintings. They seem, or they could seem kind of simple because there's so much saved white paper, but it's tricky. One of the great superpowers of watercolor is the power of the paper. So the power of what you don't paint is as strong or stronger than the power of what you do paint. So saving the light is essential. And usually that's why I think a value study is so helpful, but I just don't think I need one in this case. And I want to try to do this as a nice sketch, but a fairly quick sketch altogether. It's certainly not true that there's no color in winter. There's loads of color. It's generally much more subdued, softer, and perhaps faded or not as in your face, but there's so much color, beautiful, subtle warms and midtones, warms and cools. I'm using a little bit of yellow ochre here in the background to just hint at, I'm not really hinting at the buildings or anything in particular, I'm just laying at a sort of a neutral tone. I want this little strip of white on top of the bridge, and that will help subtly pop it out, I hope. So this is raw umber, just a nice neutral-ish warm tone. I'm painting on a piece of Baohong rough surface. It's a Baohong Master's Choice, very, very textural surface. The reason I chose it for this painting is because of the texture, and with dry brush technique, I ought to be able to suggest this sort of gauzy, out of focus feeling that you often get in winter landscapes. It was literally snowing when I was here. I don't want to make a big deal out of that, but I just want to play up that experience of what I think most of us have had, where on a snowy day, everything's quite overcast, so things aren't quite fully in focus, and I find that a very pleasant experience. So I think the rough surface paper will help me capture a little hint of that that type of beauty. This is cobalt turquoise, dropping it in here and there along these dry brush marks to create some subtle texture for the background. I'm using very little water in my brush. This is a Escoda Versatile 1/2 inch flat. Very little water, and I'm just very little pressure too as I push down on the brush, very little, to try to get some of these skip marks. What's going through my brain is I'm trying to subtly save some light here in the distance, as if the tops of some of these snow-covered trees are slightly visible in the distance. And then into that wet, I'm dropping in little bits of raw umber. So just sort of a subtle, warm, cool mixture for the background. The key is I want it to be light, but I don't want it to be pure white. I want to save the pure white mostly for the foreground here and a little bit there in the mid-ground. But yes, I don't want to kill all the light in the background coming through. Just tamp it down a little. Good enough. Such a tricky thing to paint trees with no leaves on them. I often do something like this, just a warm, subtle warm tone that's not full coverage, obviously not green, but just hopefully gives the sense of that foliage that's either dried up or small twigs on trees. When you look at winter trees from a distance, they don't just look like a collection of twigs. They have some often some sense of volume to them. So this is just raw umber. Trying to maintain a good deal of white to indicate some of the snow that's sitting on this cluster of trees that's a little closer than those. For this, I'm using a brush I often use for trees. This is an Escoda liner brush. I have several of these, a Da Vinci and a few others, but everybody has their own way of painting trees, but these brushes work for me pretty well. So if I want this crest of the hill to read quite light, which I do, that means I have to work some volume in to pop that edge out. So I'm using a bit more raw umber and very little water and just dry brushing up from the base of those distant trees to create a little contrast there. Obviously at this point I'm still trying to keep everything pretty subtle. This is violet. It's actually a lunar violet, so it's somewhat granulating. Doesn't matter too much at this scale, but just want some violet, add a little bit more volume to the base of these trees. I think that'll do for now. The water, as seen in the reference photo, this is a color photo, believe it or not, it doesn't have much color. I think I'm going to make the bridge more of a warm tone, not bright red, but brownish, neutral, warm. The background is pretty dominantly warm. These trees just need to be dark. I don't really have a color in mind yet. So anyway, I'm trying to think of what would make a good complement for the water. But I think I want to use some of this teal. But I don't want to go overboard and make it look too tropical or something. The water was quite still. It was cold, but it wasn't yet completely frozen over, so I guess I just want a sort of a blush of that teal, and then I'll go into a darker purple or violet. It's one of my favorite combinations. Teal and violet. This is Holbein mineral violet. And I'll be a little more careful over here along the edge of the foreground bank. A little bit more pigment. So I can use this wet, soft edge, but then here I'll harden it up to make some contrast to bring the interest into the foreground a bit more. The center of focus of any painting is generally where the darkest dark meets the lightest light. And that will be, I think in this case, more or less in the foreground, the figure and this dark tree, and the white I want to preserve on the snow will be the dominant area of focus for the painting. And if I have any tighter, more detailed like areas, they'll fall in this area, and radiating out from that point, things will become softer and less in focus. So to that end, as the water gets down nearer the bottom edge of the painting, I can become a little bit more impressionistic, a little looser, sloppier. And yeah, like that. But I think I'm painting on a tilt at about 20 degrees, but I'm going to tilt the board up for more angularity, more slope, therefore more gravity, and just mist the bottom of this water. So instead of brushing it on, I'll just let it sort of paint itself with gravity, keeping it nice and misty and mysterious looking. I'll work some more teal and some more violet into this while it's quite wet. The water is quite still, not moving very much, and so the dominant directionality will be vertical because of the reflections. So in watercolor, reflections can often kind of paint themselves in a way if you just use gravity, tilting the board up and letting the paint run. This is some of the deeper lunar violet. Before this dries too much, I just want to beef up the contrast in this area. That's a little stronger than I wanted, but I think it's not bad because this has harder edges which feel closer. That has softer edges which feel further away. Just painting wet and wet here, just trying to work a little bit more value into the foreground, but still keep that water pretty mid-toned, definitely not too dark, and I just really don't want it to be too busy in terms of brush marks or anything like that, so I want to do whatever I'm going to do while it's still quite wet, so it can all just run together. I think while I'm up here, I wasn't really planning it, but while this is wet, I'm going to try to do some articulation on the land side where the snow is, so that here and there it can run into the water area and all connect and look organic. So far I'm just using violet and raw umber, warm and cool. Really have a plan, it's sort of just intuitively I'm painting. Want to be cautious that I don't eat away too much of the white. You can always get rid of the white, but pretty hard to get it back once it's gone. But I just wanted this these foreground elements to step from really crisp and hard-edged to very soft and less distinct, to focus the energy here. Back here, it's a little vague what I should do. I need to pop out that light edge. I think I'll just use a little bit more violet and raw umber and just be vague about what it actually is. Doesn't matter really. So it could pass for a shadow or something in the distance, or maybe reeds or grasses growing up. The whole point is not representation, it's just getting the value where you need it. All right. This will be the dominant area, light, white. This will be secondary, which means I can afford, on this side of the river, upstream, I can afford to lose a little bit more of the white of the paper. Here it's a little more precious. So this is watered down cobalt blue. And a little bit more of teal. It's probably more teal than cobalt blue. And I'm just working in some idea of shadows or changes in some of the landscape, and trying to work in a little tone as this hill crawls down to the edge of the water. Before I'm done, these rocks are going to get a bit darker, so I have to bear that in mind. But I may have a little bit of snow on the top of a few of them. I guess the key is just not to do too much over here. It doesn't need that much. Just a little something. Wash there, not cool. Oh, it was so quiet outside with all the snow. It's almost like a snow day, but slowly the streets are sort of being cleaned, and traffic is starting to pick up again. So I'm sure you'll get to experience some of the lovely sounds of the city. Yeah, I was trying to even this area out. I think before this painting's done, I'll want more value here, but it's a nice darker mid-tone, and I think for this stage that's about where it wants to be. There'll be some deep reflections painted over as this dries, and I may add some general value down here. Now, I've been told by a few people, 2 people online, that they don't like me pointing out areas with my hand of my painting. They find it very annoying and distracting. So while I've tried not to care, it's made me very self-conscious, so I will try not to do that. Don't want to annoy anyone. Now, I mean, if it is distracting, I do want to not do it, but I can't help it when I'm painting. It's just an animating experience, so it's hard for me to just sit still and feel that contained. So I do apologize if you find it annoying. What I'm doing now is going to start adding some tonality to the bridge. Mostly it's going to be darker mid-tone, so roughly this value, but a little bit darker I expect in general. Not as dark as these trees are going to be. However, here and there, I want to save bits of white paper to imply the snow bits that might be sitting on top of some of these rocks, and definitely along the upper rail. So I think if I can do it with a flat brush, I'll be happier because I can get some of those characterful dry brush marks like that. I really like implying detail like that better than specifically stating it. Just think overall the feeling of the painting is better when it just looks, even if it's not quick, if it looks quick and confident rather than slow and methodical, generally the result is going to be more satisfying. I can paint quickly. I don't suppose it's fair to say I'm a particularly fast painter, but I am very aware of the upsides of some brush marks and some expressions being applied more quickly and with less thought. They just often look so much better. Not always, but often. That kind of careless scraping looks quite good, and I think this kind of more meticulous application can look good too. And if you mix all these different kinds of applications and brush marks together within the same painting, I don't know, to me it just makes often for a much more lively painting with more variety, more going on. So what am I using? Mostly this is sepia brown, which isn't particularly warm, but it is warm-ish, and raw umber, which is quite warm but a little lighter. To be honest, this beautiful old stone that's actually there really reads as dark gray, nearly black, and I'm well aware that part of that is just dirt and age, but I find it really attractive, so I'm a little bit enamored of that dark, shadowy color. So I'm trying to work pretty quick because I want to come into this wet wash and then drop some darker tones, like shadows or irregularities, just that mottled look that stonework would naturally have. So what I'm using at this point is some lunar violet, the granulating purpley gray. And I'm very tempted, just wasn't planning it, but I as I'm painting it, I think I want to drop in here and there's some teal. It's cobalt teal blue. Not too much of it, but I just think a little will help it look more stone-like. Yeah, it looks okay. I'm trying to decide if it needs any warmer tones. I'm not afraid of it. I'm just, I'm thinking it doesn't. I think if I get into the reds and oranges, it's going to set a mood that's altogether wrong. So this is, the warmest I'm going to use is just some pretty undiluted raw umber. I'm always trying to make my paintings feel like something, not just look like something, but feel like the experience that I had. And the sense of quiet, just this beautiful sense of peace and quiet when I was there, I think was really enhanced by these subtle colors of winter. So any color, warm or cool, that gets too bright, I think would just be a false note. Wouldn't necessarily make the painting bad, but I think it would tell a different story. And I want to keep the color range pretty wide, but the color chroma is what we used to call it in school, the brightness, the saturation, if you will, less, softer. So before that dries entirely, I want to paint the underside of the bridge. I'm using, I'm doing this now so that it bleeds up into the face of the bridge here and there, so that it doesn't look too graphic, but it just looks a little out of focus, which is also part of what I found beautiful about this scene. Winter scenes in general, things look a little mysterious and out of focus, and I like that. So these bits where you end up with softer edges all plays into that feeling. So I'm using a neutral tint, just sort of a grayish violet. It's pretty transparent. I'm not being too fancy, or I often do some reflected light up under. I don't see the need for that here. I just want to keep, if it were a larger area, I might, but it's a fairly small area, and I just want to make it, this edge especially, dark and crisp. That was a mistake. So now, when the shadow comes down to the water, what I don't want to do is just stop and allow that to dry. I want to bleed that shadow into the reflection of that shadow. So I'm going to use a little bit of the tone that's right under that already, this cobalt teal, and paint it up so that it hits that neutral tint wash and connects. I could tell I'm going to be hitting the old cobalt teal and violet pretty hard in this painting. It is one of my favorite color combinations. I use it a lot for winter. Also anything atmospheric, fog, clouds, mist, that sort of thing. So I don't want to make the reflection solid, meaning I want to leave some white bits, lighter bits reading through so that it feels like water. And as it gets further away from the subject, it can start to fragment a little bit. But just here, it really needs to bleed together. Now as it gets down this far, it'll be less dark, so I'm using a little bit more water. And this is no more teal, it's just violet. It's okay because it gives me another opportunity to darken some of this tones here. Someone else told me it was very annoying when I turn my board side to side or upside down, but I cannot apologize for that. It's my method, and I recommend you do the same. It helps if you turn your board around or give yourself the freedom to do so. If you're doing a very larger wet wash, you can control the gravity and the direction that the paint flows. So not turning the board or painting at an angle, at a tilt, is a serious disadvantage. But I turn the board around a lot just to reach certain areas more easily. But yes, to get the paint to run in the direction that I'm painting is pretty key. So these little bits of bridge that show here, I'm just trying to do them quickly now. Raw umber, violet. This is key. I'm going to be wanting to save some snow in the elbow of this tree. So this bit of value here will help make that read. I did those marks as quickly as I could because it's at the edge of the painting, and it's just a way to save your tight paintings for the area of the painting that's the center of focus, and anything that's not the center of focus, you can soften it up. It's just really, really helps your paintings have a more clear point of view and a little bit more dynamism than they might otherwise. So not too bad, live with that. I think the value of the bridge was the thing I most was concerned with. It needed to be dark, but not the darkest. So I think overall at this stage it reads as a dark mid-tone, the darkest mid-tone, which is what I wanted. So this needs to dry, and then I'll work on the foreground area. But while that's happening, I'll work on some of this. It's not the background, but the mid-ground trees that are across the stream and the rocks as well. Now, they're sort of important for the composition here, but they're not here in the center of focus. So I can afford to be a little quicker, a little sloppier with them. Again, this is the cautionary tale that I'm always trying to get people to appreciate, is if you paint from a reference photo, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but I'm just saying if you do, bear in mind that reference photos should come with a warning label for painters. They are reference, they're not the Bible. You don't have to copy them. And if anything, oh my gosh, you shouldn't. I'm being pretty literal for this painting, but this little bits over here, I'm being a little looser, a little less specific. What that'll help do, modulating the values as the painting recedes into space, but also changing the saturation, changing up the edges. Softer edges make things look farther away. Harder edges tend to make things look closer. That doesn't mean you should always put all your hard edges up front, although it's one thing you can do. It's just something you should be aware of. So as things radiate out from my center of interest, I get a little looser and messier on purpose, and generally speaking, a little less saturated and a little less color, a little less value. So these little rocks on the opposite bank here, easy thing to do would be to paint them very specifically, very darkly, very illustration-like, and it wouldn't be terrible, but it just wouldn't be as good if you can manage to modulate them, soften them, and they just still have enough presence in terms of value, but begin to fall back into space. Anything I can do on a two-dimensional painting surface, all we have are height and width. So anything I can do to imply this sense of three-dimensionality, it's not always the thing you need to worry about or think about, but it very often is, even if you paint in a completely abstract manner. This illusion of perspective, of three-dimensionality in a painting is, to me, pretty much everything. I just think it's the most magical thing. Everybody looking at a painting intellectually knows it's not three-dimensional, of course. But that it feels like it really helps the viewer to suspend their disbelief and get lost in the world of your painting. But if you fall too deeply in love with your reference photo, I mean, even this, on an overcast, snowy day, these trees look almost as high, almost as much saturation, focus, clarity on these trees as these. If you want these to look further away, you have to think about that and modulate them. So everything, especially in a digital photo, really, even though you understand what you're looking at, the reality of a photo is quite different from the reality of a painting, or I think it should be. But these digital photos, especially as taken on our cell phones, that sort of thing, are very useful. I do it all the time, but they have a way of making everything look flat. Everything appears to be in the same plane and the same surface. And I really do think it's certainly our opportunity, but it's almost our job, I think, as painters, to not do that, but to interpret reality, not just copy it. I have painter colleagues that disagree with that. And they think the best thing you can do as a painter is just to try to mimic as closely as you can reality. All I can say is it's valid. and you're welcome to do that, but I really think if you do, you're just missing great expressive opportunities as a painter. So yeah, these winter trees are a bit tricky because the easiest thing to do at this stage is to overpaint them or be overly detailed or overly specific. I really want in this painting overall to emphasize the atmospherics of the place and of the day. So to really play up, sort of romanticize the idea of things being out of focus and not especially clear. I just really like that feeling, and I'm trying my best to imbue the painting with that sense too. So one way to get there is dry brush marks where everything doesn't connect, but some of these lines are sort of stop and start, skip and jump. Dry brush marks here that sort of imply detail but aren't terribly specific about it. All good. I'm going to anchor this tree to the ground a bit. Yes, I paint with my finger a lot. So another problem I have with my YouTube content is my videos, because I like to do everything in real time with real-time commentary, my videos can tend to be a little lengthy. It means the upload time is slow. It's a bit daunting for people to watch, I think, if they're too long. So I'm trying to keep them under an hour. So to that end, I don't know if I'll finish this painting 100% on camera, but I'm going to try to get as far as I can. So I'm using one of my brushes. This is a Neef brush, N-E-E-F, my name. They're a series of mops from quite large to very, very small. I'm using one of the smallest ones. They make a beautiful point and hold a good deal of water. So for this kind of calligraphy, these smaller ones work really well. For these trees that are more in the background, I don't want them, again, to be overly detailed or specific. So this kind of intuitive calligraphy approach works pretty well. Just trying to build up a texture more than anything else. I'm going to swap back to a 1/2 inch flat and some watered down raw umber and paint up from the top or down from the top of the painting. Very little water, just some dry brush marks, just to add some texture, to imply some of this volume of these background trees without literally painting every twig and branch. That's not so bad. There'll be some larger, or not larger, yes, but more foreground limbs laid over this whole thing, which will be darker. And I think overall that should marry together nicely. Because so much of that was done in dry brush, it doesn't take long to dry. So I think I can start while I'm here working up some of those darker foreground limbs. This is another Escoda brush, a Perla. These are flats. This is a number 4, so it's a very small, 1/8 inch, I think, flat. And very handy for this kind of thing. You can paint very specifically, or if you paint much quicker, you can get some beautiful dry brush effects. So again, these limbs I want to look as if they fall in front of everything. So they're a little more specific, but primarily they're a little darker in value. And because of everything else I've set up in this painting, I'm hoping that overall the darker values will just logically appear closer to us, and the softer values will, in this design, will logically appear further away. Anyway, that's my hope. But even here in this little microcosm, you can see this darker value, just even though it's right next to the lighter values, it just automatically begins to pull forward and look closer. I talk endlessly ad nauseum about the importance of having a value design and thinking a lot about values in your painting. I say this all the time because it's generally true, but I think in painting, color gets so much of the credit, but value does all the work, does all the heavy lifting. I'm not anti-color by any means, but no color, however beautiful it is going to save your painting if it's got a muddled or indistinct value design. So what I'm using here, this is lunar violet actually, but it doesn't matter too much because I'm using so little water. I don't have black pigment, but very little water, not exactly opaque, but pretty thick application, just to try to get it as reasonably dark as I can. So yes, surely I'll be adding more texture to these foreground trees. But if there's a lesson for teaching, I think it really is the value. Even just here, you can see these thin hanging twigs, because they're more distinct, but mostly because they're darker, they just feel closer to you than that tree, which is relatively in focus, but softer, lighter in value. And some of you, I'm sure, hearing me say that and saying to yourself, well, yeah, duh, obviously. Yeah, it is obvious, but it's not always self-evident when we're painting. You know, painting, you get so into every little thing you're doing that you can sometimes lose the overall, the big picture. So that's why it's always good to have a value plan before you start, which is why I'm such a fan of value studies. I did not do one for this because I really felt the reference photo was a pretty good indicator. But also I just knew that this bridge, for example, needed to be lighter than this tree was going to be. This tree needed to hang over the whole scene, and a collection of darker values that would make it pull forward of the lighter values behind. So I'm talking about how obvious it is. Maybe it is, but it's going to become much more evident when I paint in, as I'm going to quite soon, the darker parts of this tree and connect all these dark shapes together. So even here, these dark twigs hanging down in front of the lighter bridge, they tend to feel forward. Lapping values over values is a good way to go. So while I'm here, I want to add a little bit more texture to this midground trees. So I've washed out my brush using a bit more water, a bit less value, and adding some textural elements to this tree, which I should have done earlier, but I forgot. I love doing these videos, but it is strange to paint and talk at the same time. I do it a lot for public demonstrations, and I'm okay at it. I'm sort of adept at it, but it doesn't mean I'm always very good at it. I have to keep my brain working in two different directions. So this is sepia, deep brown, and I've mixed a little neutral tint into it to be about as dark as I'm going to get anything in the painting. As even though it's foreground, as the tree climbs up to the top, I'll paint quite quickly so I get some dry brush marks to sort of filter out the visual elements of the tree as they reach out from the center of focus. I don't know if it's really like that in reality, but I think that dry brush graphic kind of helps the winter feeling. I can make it look as if it's snow blowing up on part of the tree. It wasn't really planned, but it kind of works. So this tree will be pretty much the darkest single element in the painting, the largest area of dark anyhow. So as it comes down to the ground, very close to the center of focus, this is pretty much undiluted neutral tint. Again, I don't have black, but it's pretty dark. It still stays quite transparent. And then as it meets the snow, I want to be pretty this feeling, but in a darker, even more specific way, a little bit more graphic, as it just cuts into the snow really cleanly. This will help it look forward, but also it'll feel more like the foreground if things are a little bit more in focus over here. I'll save some white as if there's some bits of snow settling up the trunk at different levels. There we go, not too bad, except this drawing not as dark as I want it to, but I don't want to lose all my whites. I'll try to maintain what I have. This is a bit of a pretty undiluted raw umber. I'm just dropping it into this super dark wash to kind of leaven it a little. Also, because it's my favorite, this is a Holbein lavender. Beautiful semi-opaque color. It's not gouache, it's still watercolor, but it has a little opacity to it. And I love to drop it into deep valued washes, deep greens or browns or grays. It's a heavy paint, it sinks down and then kind of floats up and makes these intentional blossoms, which if you're lucky, look really good, and if you're not, don't. But it's a beautiful wintry color too, it can be. I just think a little of that cool modulating that dark warm is not a bad way to go. Okay, I'm not unhappy with this transition. That looks a little abrupt, so I'll use one of my smaller flats and some more of this teal and just try to anchor the base of this tree to the ground. It's not a sunny day, so there wouldn't be elongated, harsh shadows, but there are planar irregularities in the surface of the snow, so a little bit of this blue teal. Not a bad addition. So I don't want to do too much more here. Of course, I want to paint the figure and some anchoring of the figure, but before the tree dries, I want to try to flesh out some more of the major branch structure that I started. So you can see here, even on the smaller parts of this tree, some of them I'm being a little more careful, a little more specific. Not all of them. I'll come in soon with some scrappy or dry brush marks, but I think it needs a little bit of that dark specificity to pull it forward, to really make it obviously look in the foreground. For some of these areas where I want it to appear like snow is gathered, I've had bad luck using any kind of really opaque paint, like additive of white, that sort of thing. I'm not saying I haven't, I have. I'm not saying I wouldn't, I would. But generally, I think proceeding with caution is good, or a little of that goes a long way. So we'll see as this dries. I'm hoping I don't have to use any additive white. I don't use masking fluid. Again, I'm not opposed to it. There are artists who are really, really phenomenally skilled at it. I'm not. I also just don't think it suits my technique. I like a hand-struck edge, even if it looks messy. I just prefer it in my technique. So I'm not a purist, I'm not anti-masking fluid, I just don't use it. So that's fine, I guess, but if I don't, then yeah, if I want to save a bit of white on the top of the bridge, for example, or anything here, or little bits of white on the trees, this is the kind of painting where masking fluid might actually not have been a bad idea, even for me. But I don't own any, so I couldn't use it if I wanted to, but it would not have been a bad idea. I really love the challenge, if I'm honest, of this negative shape painting and trying to preserve white. But it's a personal thing and an aesthetic thing. You shouldn't use it or not use it because you have some attitude. I think you should just use it if it makes your paintings better. For me, it generally makes them worse. Or perhaps I'm just not very skilled at using it, which is entirely possible. Most all of the major elements of the painting are in. I wished I had worked in some background trees back here. I think that texture would help. I could add some more of the dark foreground twigs and limbs, and probably will do. But I really think another tree would have helped me. And maybe had I done a value study, that would have become clear. Well, I was arrogant and didn't do one because I thought I didn't need it. Now I'm wondering, but oh well. We'll work with what we've got. I think I can retrofit a little lower trees behind this guy. And if I'm lucky, it should work out okay. So for this, I'm just using this, for now at least, this 1/8 inch flat. Really just to add texture and nothing that will compete with a foreground tree, but really just to animate that space that's left behind. But yeah, I think I can MacGyver a tree in here. Upside down we go. This is the very small mop brush again. Very little water in it. It holds a good deal of water, so I'm pulling it out with a paper towel so I can do more dry brush marks. Yeah, better already. I think at this point I can get away from representation and just go to the 1/2 inch flat. Back to the raw umber and just add some of this kind of textural identity here. So, ooh. These aren't actually meant to be trees, they're just textural additives which might appear to be tree-like, but it doesn't really matter. It's just adding texture and a little bit more value. Now I'm going to go for my larger 3/4 inch versatile Escoda. We're just over the 1 hour mark, but I'm very nearly done, so I want to paint in the figure, a couple of other things, and I don't know what to say. I try to just be very honest about how I paint, and I have this feeling like for those of you who wish to watch, it's helpful, and for those of you who get bored or run out of steam, I don't know what I can say. I'll try as I evolve to get better at editing videos, but I just think real-time demonstrations are so much more helpful. So this video is probably going to be more like 1.5 hours. Anyway, all that was not expected, but I think it made a huge difference. It added, again, texture and value and obscurity that I think was appropriate. It amplified the clarity here and then added obscurity where it wasn't helpful. And the values to me now overall look much more where they want to be. So I'll add the figure and a little bit more value here, some sense of those reflections, and then if I do any more work to this, I'll post it as a thumbnail, of course, the finished version, but also I'll post the finished painting on my other socials. You can see it if you want. It'll be on Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, Threads, wherever you consume your social media. Me, I don't know. I'm everywhere. So the person wants more than anything to read as a dark shape against the light snow. Not exactly the focus of the painting, but he's a little focal, so I want to be a little more specific and careful. But the overall task is to make this wintry figure dark against the light snow. So I start at the top of the figure with some neutral tint on the hat, dropped in a little bit of Mayan orange. I don't want to paint the coat in specifically. I just want to imply that it has some color. And I'm going back to neutral tint while it's quite wet and let it all just run together. So to me, that's a nice way of implying color without being too picky or too overly specific about it. Yeah, I always feel like every painting, everything in that painting ought to look like it belongs in that painting. So if you're doing a sketch, which this is sort of a nicer sketch, a more finished looking sketch, I hope. But because of that, the amount of real detail or clarity should be kept to a minimum, I think. You can have some. But mostly everything in that painting ought to look like it belongs in that painting and not as if it's wandered in from some other painting. So to that end, this guy standing here should look loose and sketch-like, even though he has a little specificity, but not too much. I'll anchor him to the snow with some teal, little divots in the snow. Okay, across the way there are these trees reflecting down into the water. The water, as I said earlier, isn't moving too much. It's pretty still. So the reflections will be pretty specific, fairly unbroken. But they want to be a little bit more obvious or a little bit more clarity up near the bank, closer to where they begin. And then as they stretch down into the water, they can become a little more vague and filtered out. Use the side of this half-inch flat to add a little bit more textural depth to the distant bank, some sort of indiscriminate reflections, shadowing and things. A little brighter area there, and then I'm going to run a larger wash over the bottom, just a tonal wash. For that, I'll use a larger one of my mops. This is a number 4. So what I want to do is just add some value, but I don't, no, there's another way to do it. Rather than a wash, I could brush up from the bottom. Perhaps that'll be more appropriate. So I'm changing my mind. This is the 3/4 inch Escoda flat versatile. So I'm going to paint up from the bottom, just some violet. This is another way to run a wash, but it has obviously more texture capability. But it allows for some of these dry brush marks, some sense of light to read through. Then as I get over to the area of snow, I'll go away from the violet, more into the teal. And the point of this is not to kill the light, but to knock it back a little, to add a little mystery here in the foreground, and then to help focus the light here where you really want it. So yeah, I think that worked better overall than running a big wash. That said, I still want a bit more value along the bottom. So while that's quite wet, this is some lunar violet. Just brush that into that wet wash. Tilt it up. It's subtle, but it adds a little bit of anchor to the whole painting. So the painting's largely finished. I think I'm happy with the fact that I can get away with not having to use any opaque white to add highlights. Again, I'm not opposed to it. I really just feel it looks artificial on my paintings. It looks very additive and not organic. It's not that I wouldn't and haven't done it. I just would rather not in this case. So I'll add a few little things as this painting dries. I think I can come in and add more texture to these foreground, but thinner, smaller overhanging branches. And a few other little things, but all very minor. But for the most part, that's the entire painting, start to finish. Yeah, I don't want to do that too quickly, and I think I should wait till it dries a bit more. But I think you can see what I've tried to do is imbue this winter scene with the subtle tonalities of winter. I've tried to use the composition as the photo shows, but to invent a more clear, more convincing sense of three-dimensionality and depth. And I think by layering the values, the dark, midtones, and lights, that all works pretty well. Whatever clarity in the painting pretty much happens here, which is the center of focus. Everything else, for the most part, fades out with less detail, with the exception of a little bit of detail over here, and I'm wondering if that shouldn't be toned down a little, but I think it's okay. You get sort of a nice enclosure of the light. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I will try to join you again before Christmas, but it's very nearly travel time for me, so I'll be away for a week or so. But I want to thank you all for all your attention, great comments, and just your time this whole year. I'm very grateful to you. So thanks so much, and I will see you again soon. Happy holidays.